Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to be decoding the hidden, historical blueprints of empire building to see exactly what they reveal about our modern world. History usually focuses on those ruthless conquerors, right? But what happens when fiercely independent nations try to join forces without a single absolute dictator forcing them all together?
Well, let's dive right into this fascinating question. We're going to compare two massive historical experiments, the 16th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Safavid Empire, to an entity you probably hear about in the news literally every single day, the European Union. Are these decentralized structures the ultimate path to continental wealth? Or are they just bureaucratic traps destined for total collapse?
Here's how we're going to break down the life cycle of these geopolitical giants. We'll cover how geography shapes the state, blueprints for unification, the profit of trade, the veto problem, cycles of stagnation, and finally, what a multipolar future looks like.
All right, let's start with Section 1. Geography shapes the state.
Because think about it. Before you can even build a state, you actually have to survive your map. And this brilliantly illustrates our very first problem. The European plain is this vast, totally flat stretch of land running from France all the way into Russia, with basically no natural barriers. It practically begged for constant invasions. Compare that to the Iranian plateau, which is where the Safavid Empire rose up. It is a literal fortress of mountains and high deserts. That's great for keeping outsiders out, sure, but it is an absolute nightmare if you're trying to centralize power internally.
So for the better part of 1,000 years, European nations had to pour almost all their wealth into massive militaries just to survive those flat plains. They essentially lived by a fundamental, maybe slightly cynical rule of statecraft. War is good for business, but really only if you're the one winning. If you weren't winning, it was just a massive, completely unsustainable drain on your resources.
Which brings us to Section 2, Blueprints for Unification. How do you actually stop that endless warfare?
Well, to stop the bloodshed, you have to embrace another crucial rule of survival, which is basically expand or die. You have to give warring factions an overriding, absolutely undeniable reason to put down their swords and actually start cooperating with each other.
To survive, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth back in 1569, actually a lot like the modern EU, relied on economic and political integration. They shared a single large parliament and stripped away their internal tariffs. The Safavids, on the other hand, took a radically different path. In 1501, they unified their isolated mountain tribes by forging this really rigid, singular religious identity. They declared Shia Islam the state religion, basically so they could stand unified against their Sunni neighbors.
Moving on to Section 3, the profit of trade. This is where we see the shift from survival to wealth.
Once unified, these massive entities completely shift their focus. They go from mere survival to unprecedented wealth generation. By turning their former rivals into business partners, they activate a brilliant new rule: trade equals profit. As it turns out, you don't actually need to conquer your neighbors to get rich. You just need to trade with them.
Just look at this staggering reality. To put this into perspective, Poland has experienced nearly an 800% GDP growth simply by joining the EU in 2004 and getting access to the barrier-free Schengen area. By seamlessly selling components to wealthy neighbors like Germany without facing a single trade barrier, their regional wealth literally exploded.
So whether it's the Safavid Shah acting as the Silk Road's ultimate middleman, or the EU's single market allowing the completely frictionless flow of goods and people across borders, the winning strategy is exactly the same. Controlling high-value trade routes without internal friction is how you build continental superpowers. You see, you don't need the biggest population, you just need to be the middleman.
But here's the catch. Section 4, the veto problem, the fatal flaw of every empire.
This right here is the fatal Achilles heel of absolutely every decentralized superpower: the veto. I mean, have you ever tried getting 27 friends to agree on exactly where to eat? Now imagine running an entire continent that way. In the old Commonwealth, nobility who were terrified of taxes introduced the liberum veto, where literally any single noble could freeze a law. Today, the EU's consensus model often leaves major foreign policy totally paralyzed. And for the Safavids, protecting local power meant that governors prioritized their own personal wealth over the nation. The end result? Systemic paralysis, every single time.
In the Safavid court, this dynamic became a pretty grim reality. As the saying goes, the bigger the smile, the sharper the knife. As the Shahs grew more and more isolated in their grand palaces, corrupt local elites just prioritized lining their own pockets over national survival. The state's broader interests were entirely sacrificed for local, selfish gains.
Which leads us to Section 5, Cycles of Stagnation. The descent begins.
When a state can no longer make unified decisions, the boom phase abruptly ends, and this tragic, identical life cycle takes over. It always starts with elites being completely terrified of centralized control. They use their vetoes to block government reforms because, someone always benefits from the status quo. Without reform, the military and the infrastructure begin to rot, ultimately leaving the entire state as sitting ducks for rising, highly centralized competitors.
Because the Safavids and the Commonwealth couldn't bypass their own internal vetoes to modernize, they were completely left in the dust when global trade shifted to the seas. The Commonwealth, physically unable to act as a single defensive unit, was literally carved off the map in 1795. They were partitioned entirely out of existence by stronger, centralized neighbors like Russia and Prussia.
Bringing us to our final part, Section 6, a multipolar future. We are at a modern crossroads.
And this brings us directly to today. For decades, the EU relied heavily on the US military umbrella, which allowed them to focus almost entirely on economic growth. But the world is returning to a really dangerous multipolarity, especially with the rapid rise of new superpowers like China and India. An economic union without sharp teeth is incredibly vulnerable right now. They urgently need independent tech and defense capabilities just to survive this new era.
History is echoing loud and clear here. The EU must now make a really stark choice. They can give up those fiercely protected local vetoes to build a true, unified continental defense, or they can repeat the exact same stagnation that doomed the Commonwealth. They basically have to decide if they are willing to hand over real power to a central government just to remain globally competitive. I'll leave you with this final thought as we wrap up this explainer. The European Union has beautifully proven that trade is a much better path to prosperity than war. But history clearly shows us that even the wealthiest unions will collapse if they lose the ability to actually make a decision. So, will the EU adapt to the modern world, or are they going to become just another collapsed empire in the history books? Thank you so much for watching.